We're here to talk today about the indie landscape and how it's evolving. And evolve is a really interesting term because it doesn't just mean change, it also means progression. How do you think that progress in independent games has been driven? What's been pushing it forwards?
I mean, there are some obvious ways in which you could say that things have progressed, right? And I think these are the things that everybody knows, so I don't want to spend too much time on them. But like, hey, it's easier to make a game than it ever was, right? More people making games than there ever were. Which means if you want to get into it, it's easier to get into it than it ever has been. It's hard to judge if you want to actually succeed at making games and continue to do it. I can't actually tell whether it's easier or harder now because, you know, of all these other factors. So that's all good. I would say though, like if you talk about progress, like as a medium, like are games getting better in their own right, like independent games? I'm not sure. Like not much better than the ambient level at which games improve over time gradually as designers just have better things to look back on and refer to. So I think that has generally been a constant positive trend, but you know, the promise of, there was some kind of promise if you go back 10 years ago or something that once all these independent people are making games, there's going to be this great explosion of creativity and games are going to be really awesome. And I think for the most part, most developers are too afraid to actually do that. And so we don't really see much genuine creativity.
Oh, right.
Yeah, there's a small number of people who I would say actually do creative stuff. And then everybody else is trying to be like a cheap AAA game.
Do you think that's like following trends then? Everyone's like trying to jump on the next?
I mean, some of that. Like everybody has their own motivation, right? A lot of the time it's just somebody thinks it's cool to make a game and all their reference material in their head is like, you know, Call of Duty or something. Yeah. Or, not that many indies try to make Call of Duty, but you know, something mainstream, right? And so then they go and just essentially try to make that with differences, right? Which is, I would say, a more innocent version of not being creative because you're just excited about something, but happens a lot, right?
So do you think, as sort of we've had this democratization of tools, do you think it's got more exciting, the kind of diversity we're seeing in the themes that are coming out? So people are starting to talk about much broader topics. Like, does that excite you?
I don't think that's happening.
You don't think that's happening?
I mean, I think that there was a brief period maybe around 2008 to 2010 or 11 when that expanded. And then it's been stagnant pretty much. I mean, and you know, part of the problem is, I think there's a conceptual problem, okay? And also, and I don't wish to blame anyone specific. It's like a global thing illustrated by the way that you phrase the question even. That there's games about topics that are whatever, and it's like, I don't see games as being very good at, like I don't think you can just pick a topic and then make a game out of it and have it be a good game. It doesn't really work that way because the material of games, like the interactivity, is its own topic. And when you try to do that, you end up like jamming things together that don't really fit together. And I think that's what most people who try to be creative end up doing. Like, I want to make a game about some idea where some idea is like a fiction idea. And they do that and the game and the fiction don't fit together very well, and it's a fiction idea that would have been better if it was a book or a film or a song and not a game. And I think that happens a lot. And for some reason, nobody notices this problem or works on it, right? Like ever since around the 2009 or 2010 timeframe, people have been doing that a lot. Most of these aren't very good as games. They haven't been, they continue to not be, and people don't. So that's one of the avenues when you ask, is there progress there? I would say there actually isn't progress there in terms of people making, let's say, more artful stuff. I don't want to be super negative this whole time. Wow, I got off on a really negative bend there.
So wait, so switching it around then. So what have you seen of kind of the new indie generation where you're like, really impressed by it, and you're like, this is something that looks different to the medium now. This is something that's using it in a really clever new way.
Well, it's mostly not the people who are doing stuff like picking a topic and making a game about it, right?
Right,
It's
okay.
mostly people who are working in, pick very specific areas and work on them, you know? So, for example, like I've brought this up a few times in the world, but Steven's Sausage Roll, I think, is one of the most impressive games ever made. It's a game very few people have played. It's a puzzle game. It's pretty hard, but it does a very good job of exploring a certain space of interactivity, and in fact of doing, like I would characterize the game as doing avant-garde things with regard to controls and with regard to like understanding how players see and approach and solve problems that most designers would be better off if they had been exposed to and educated about, and yet nobody pays attention to this game. You know? And so that's one sign to me that things aren't really progressing, is when somebody does, like there's some things in that game that are really daring and go right to the heart of like the interactivity of games, like what is happening when you control a game, and they're choices that most designers would not even think to make, or they would be scared of making, and they are made in that game, and they're made very well, and that happens, and there's no conversation about it. And what that tells you is that almost nobody is in a position to notice what was done in the game. Because if they did notice it and were impressed by it, some people would be talking about it, and yet that doesn't happen. And so that's a sign to me that maybe, I mean, maybe we'll get there later as an industry, but we're not there right now. There's designers in general are not that good.
Okay, cool.
You know?
So everyone needs to go away and play that game.
Yeah.
Just a little bit about your...
Wow, I'm super negative today.
No, it's cool.
It's being
so
in
we'll talk a
London.
little bit about your development on The Witness. So you had 6.5 years on that. It was very open. You showed it very early.
Yeah.
How do you feel that open development has affected the industry?
You mean open in terms of showing more of what you're
Very
working on?
transparent, yeah.
I don't really know. I mean, I don't think, like the old approach was, you know, show your game at some point, get people really interested in it, and then for another year after that or something, keep showing it. But before that year, to maintain interest, but before that year, you know, don't really show it very much. Of course, everybody always got that wrong. Like we thought we were doing that with The Witness, and then it took like 5 years after we showed it to finish. So it's not that people always kept very closely to that plan. But that was the plan. Now I don't really know what works. Like, I don't think anyone really knows what works. But again, you know, whenever I get on this subject, I have to retreat back to like what's actually important. So here's the thing, you know, the title of this session is like how the indie landscape is evolving, right? I mean, it's always evolving. Or making games is always evolving, and everybody is always concerned with like what's going on right now, like what about Epic Store and what about streaming and whatever. And it's like, okay, look, I mean, I've been doing this long enough. I'm certainly not one of the people who's been doing this the longest, but I've been doing it since 1996. And like every couple of years, there's new things, and everybody's just as panicked and interested in the new things every couple of years, right? And so you have to decide as a developer, what time frame am I trying to play on, right? Am I a developer who's concerned with 1 or 2 years, or am I building an arc where I'm going to have really accomplished something in 20 or 30 years, right? And if you're playing for that longer term, then maybe it makes some sense to not be so worried about the shorter term things. You can't completely disregard the shorter term things, or you won't be able to eat any food, and that will be bad, right? But like, I think the effort is usually not proportioned well. Like people spend most of their effort thinking about like, oh my God, how do I, you know, what do I do about streaming or something? And not that much effort on like, is the game that I'm making really that good? And is it something that people would want to play in 20 years? I don't know very many developers who ask themselves that question, honestly. Most people say, oh yeah, of course, because it's my game. But like, if you ask that honestly, like look at the rate of games that are played, and people don't shoot very high, I guess, is what I'm saying. And I think they don't really want to shoot high because it's hard. It feels hard to think about that, to think about like, what would I have to do to make that something really good like that. And so they take this excuse of like worrying about all this stuff. And so to get back to the question, today definitely it's hard to get people to know about your game. There's so many games and there's so many other things for people to do. I'm sure this has been discussed many times at this conference. Mobile game people have different ways of approaching it than my kind of people, but that's just something that you approach tactically on a day-to-day basis while you also do the important work of trying to make something really interesting that people are going to appreciate. And it's that latter part that I think falls away when people get too worried about the other thing.
It's interesting when you were talking about these kind of longer developments. I know that you've mentioned that there's this other game that you're working on that you're kind of incrementally making and want to incrementally release that's going to sort of grow in complexity. Is that what you think it's? Do you think that's the process of evolution, that's going to be kind of like, you want this one thing you're going to work on? And
that's one thing that I got interested in designing. I think games tend to be better when people put more effort into them. I don't think that's even a secret of any kind. I think everybody understands that. There is just an issue of practicality of like how long can people spend on games? How risky is it? Do you go out of business if you make a game for a long time? Or do you fail to make it because you can't maintain the motivation for a long time? But I think history has shown that when you spend longer on a game, it's better, usually, almost always. So that is the extent to which that I could say that there's a model for making good things, but I think everybody has their own style of what they want to make, and I wouldn't attempt to claim that anyone's style is really, the model for the future.
How do you think design expectations from players have changed? I don't know if and does that affect how you design? Are you aware of how those expectations have changed, then you match that?
Well, I'm kind of not sure. The most major way in which expectations have changed is that they've broadened. There's a lot of different groups of people who are interested in playing a game, and they're different from each other, right? And so the good news about that is that if you're a small to medium-sized team, you don't need everybody in the world to buy your game. And so it's more likely now than ever before, probably. Well, okay, it's more true than ever before that there exists some group of people who will be interested in the game that you make, right? The part that's questionable is whether it's harder to get to those people than it has been in the past or not. But they exist now, whereas in the past they might not have even existed. Well, I would say in the 80s and early 90s, there was a variety in player base, and then as games got super mainstream, that died off for a while, and then now it's kind of back. So again, things are maybe a little bit cyclical. Games in the 1980s were really weird, and especially home computer games, and people forget what games were like back then. They were often very artistic. They were often very creative. So if somebody wants to pat themselves on the back today because they made a game about emotions, it's like, people were doing that in the 1980s.
Do you not think it's got more diverse, what people are making games about? The themes?
Oh, it has. It's just, I'm not saying that hasn't happened. I am saying, if you're talking about progress in exploring the medium, I think the progress has not been as large as people assume. There has been some, but it hasn't been as big as people think.
Wow. Just moving on to collaboration. So with your, how many people did you have on Witness? It was
at the very beginning, it was just me. Then for a while, it was 3 or 4 people full time, and then probably at peak, we were organizing about 21 people, of some contractors, some employees.
Is it true you worked with an architect on that one?
We worked with about 6 architects.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
What was that like? Do you think another way of games sort of moving forwards and getting better is working with other specialisms and bringing in experts from other fields?
It can definitely help. So the reason we started working with architects was we wanted to make this game with this island with all sorts of interesting things on it. And the game had to have gravitas. It had to be like serious. And if you go to a game concept artist and ask them, drop some concept for this fictional building, you know, if they're not educated in buildings, then what you'll get back just doesn't maybe have a certain depth to it, I would say.
Is that based in reality? Like you want it to look more real, or?
I wouldn't quite say real, but I would say detailed in a way that isn't naive. So for example, it's hard to explain why this matters if you don't already get it, but after we started working with screenshots, I was looking through a video game magazine, right? There's a large image on the page about some forthcoming RPG, single-player RPG that everyone was excited about, and the screenshot was like a bridge going over a river with some guards, typical RPG scene.
Sure.
The bridge, I could tell now that I'd been looking at things and was thinking about this, was like a tiny footbridge, but it had been scaled up by about 10 times.
Oh, yeah.
And it was just like this massive, tiny footbridge going over. If you want to convince people that you've paid attention to details and given them something that's well considered and that you cared about, then that kind of thing breaks that feeling in the player. Now, that probably doesn't break the feeling in most players because most players are maybe not thinking about bridges, but there's other versions of that. There's fiction versions of it and whatever. And most games fail at that to some degree.
Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, you've made these amazing games, Braid, The Witness, both puzzle games, both really complex when you get into them. What makes a Jonathan Blow game? Do you think that helped pushing the medium forwards? Is people like exploring one theme and moving through it, getting better and better incrementally?
I definitely have a style of what I'm interested in. I mean, and the style that I'm talking about is actually often not what people most obviously see in the game, right?
Oh, right, okay.
So you know, like I've been the main designer on these games. There's been an entire team of people on The Witness, right? And you know, even Braid was several people, even though it's often PR'd as like only me. That's not the case, right? Often one of the first things people see is the visuals of the game, right? And I definitely had a very large role in directing those for The Witness, but didn't do them by hand, right? And so the parts that are my style are like deeper down, and they have to do with exploring the space of possibilities and, you know, making sure, like, showing the player what's interesting about this set of gameplay details that we've chosen, right? And I mean, that's certainly in common to Witness and Braid. Will that be a thing in the next game? I'm not sure. Well, no, it'll be a thing. Will it be as obvious, or will it be as close to the main point? Probably. Yeah, it's probably just my style.
So, like, where do you start with that then? Obviously, you've got this style. How do you kick off a project? Where do you start?
Well, you just have to have an idea that you really care about really deeply. And fortunately, I've always had something like that sitting around somewhere.
Oh, cool.
At some point, if I ever don't, then I'm not sure how to start a game.
Yeah.
But it's actually, a lot of people ask me that. They're like, how do you decide if an idea is worth working on? Like, I've been asked that a lot lately. And I relate to the question because if I go back far enough in time, I wasn't very good at choosing ideas, and I would sort of work on things and then drop them because I wasn't that interested eventually.
Okay.
So something changed around the time I started working on Braid, where I found ideas that I really cared about and was willing to pursue over multiple years through very hard times. And that might just be amount of experience in the field or something, I don't know. Or just the seriousness of the mindset with which I was trying to come up with something to do.
So you're also, as well as being a game designer, an angel investor, co-founder of the Indie Fund. Looking at kind of how games are evolving, how game designers are changing. What has it changed what you're looking for when you invest in something? Is it in the studio? Is it in the people? Has that metric changed?
It has changed a little bit. So in the old days, the number one thing we were looking for was, is this person or group of people even capable of making a game? Because it was so hard.
Right.
Right. So now, most people can like open Unity and like make something happen and push the button and make an executable out of it. The question is that thing any good, right? And so the number one thing that I look for these days is like, are they able to put together a prototype that shows what's interesting about it? Like, why am I going to want to play this thing? Really, there's really no way to underestimate the number of people who say, I want to make a video game, and then they go and they start like copying the outward structure of a game. Like, I've got a menu screen, and like I could pick levels and whatever. And what do you do on the levels? Well, you know, it's not that interesting, but my character looks funny or something, you know? A lot of people do that. And that's really making a mistake, right? Because the easy part of the game is making something in the structure of a game. The hard part is like making sure it's worth people's time and that they're really going to want to, you know, play it.
That's interesting. So, I mean, do you take any inspiration from other mediums then? Is there any other mediums where you're looking at it and you're like, they're doing that? They're
In
already
terms of
exploring that?
as an investor or as a creative?
As a creative.
Yeah, I use other mediums as a reality check.
Right.
Like, so, you know, if you read novels, you know how good stories can be. And you probably know where game stories land on that quality bar if you've read good novels. If you've seen film, you know how good some certain kind of nonverbal communication can be, you know. You watch especially some of these directors that do long shots that are not boring, you know. Somebody like Tarkovsky or David Lynch or something. And in a long shot that's not boring, there has to be an evolution in your mind of what's going on, of what you think you're looking at. Because otherwise you're bored. You're like, oh, I'm looking at this door for 10 minutes, right?
Right.
And so there's a kind of like a slow changing or there's something very interesting in film that doesn't get talked about very much. And I'm definitely paying attention to that. I mean, even in regular shots in film, that's there. But like long shots really focuses on just that thing, right? You can learn things by looking at every medium. And then you have to go back to your own work and ask yourself, am I doing something that is the game's version of whatever these other things are doing? That is cool. It's not, you know, I'm not trying to do like long cinematic shots in a game, because those are always terrible because it's a 3D rendered scene and we don't know how to do that well. But are you doing something that's as interesting in your game as this novel did or as this play did, right? The answer is usually not quite, because it's very hard. It's a younger medium, but it's a good way to keep yourself honest and working hard.
Bit of a sideways question, but sort of mechanics to story. Which one do you think is driving the industry forwards the most? You know, like when we get, is zeitgeist important in games? Are you interested in people making games where they're talking about something really relevant right now and they're using games to make a commentary on it? Do you think that's pushing it forwards?
Well, I don't think games are very good at commentary right now. We might reach a time when they are, but still, you know, we're at about, you know, if you ask about the medium being pushed forward, you know, there was a game by Rod Humble called The Marriage, which he did sometime in the single-digit 2000s. I'm going to say like 2006. I don't know if that's when it was. I forget the year, 2004. And we're still at about that level of design technology when it comes to commentary on a subject. Nobody's really done anything that was stepwise different from that. People have done things bigger in quantity, so like they've made bigger games. But as designers, we haven't advanced past that. And so it's very simplistic commentary that we're able to do right now. If it's an actual game, if it's the story, sure. But stories in games would be better if without the game. So why are we doing that, right? Why don't you just go tell a story if you want to tell a story that's a commentary on something? It would be better. So Yeah, I don't know. I'm soundly on the gameplay side because that is the place that is the most sophisticated and interesting and isn't just a copy of what we see in other media, but is a place where we're developing our own ideas and making our own progress.
So interaction itself is the metric for evolution in games.
Well, interaction isn't a metric, right? But it's
but it's evolution. So like people trying to tell stories and getting it much closer to what you're doing being the story. Would you say that's getting closer towards progress with the medium?
That's one way to progress. Like if you're going to have a story, then having the story work better with the gameplay is one way to progress, right? For sure. I'm not that interested in stories in games in that way. I mean, I'm interested in elements of story. So there's things in story like mood, character, and setting. All of those are things, individual atoms, well, they're not really atoms, but individual pieces of storytelling that work well in games, right? Games are good at making settings. They're good at establishing mood. What they're not good at is plot. So why are we copying these storytelling structures that have plot? Why don't we take the parts that work for us and discard the parts that don't work for us, right? And so I'm not that personally interested in this way of, we're making things that are basically movies where you play in between the scenes.
Right.
Now, those games make a great deal of money right now, right? So that's not my primary goal in life, is to make a great deal of money. If that is your goal in life, you probably shouldn't be in games business anyway, because there's other places where you can make a lot more money for the same amount of work. But those games are very popular. So I'm not saying that that's not the case. I just, what's most popular is not always what's best. And it's not even most popular necessarily, because if you look at, some of the most popular games in the past couple of years have been things like PUBG or Fortnite, right? PUBG was big, and then Fortnite was even bigger. Those aren't story-based games. Fortnite is way bigger than any single-player, cutscene-driven narrative game. So, I think over time that'll continue to be true, and that'll increase, where we'll be even further in these areas where the popular games are playing to the strengths of games.
That's fantastic. Cool. So I'm going to open it up for questions now. Has anyone got a question for Jonathan?
You were talking about discoverability, and so do I think that the problem is that there are all these games that are so creative and that aren't really being discovered? I don't really think that's the main problem. I do think that it's hard for small games to be discovered, especially if a game is small and very wacky and doesn't dress itself up as something that people know. I think it's hard for those games to get discovered, but frankly, also those games usually aren't very good at what they're trying to do, if I'm being very honest. My number one beef with the modern, younger generation of game makers is that this idea has been developed that making games is about being in a community, and as long as you're in that community and feel good community feelings and make games, then you should succeed, and if you're not succeeding, then the world is making a mistake or something. And that's not really, the problem is there's a reality out there, and reality is actually kind of harsh. People will judge your game kind of harshly. They don't care about your game, right? We wish they did, but they don't. And so it's not really about being in a community. It's nice if you have community, it's nice if you have friends, but the number one thing is making something that interests people, and I wish we worked harder at that.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much. Can we have a round of applause for Jonathan?